Hey guys, today we're going to be discussing the World's Fairs in Spain. Now this is really interesting because while a lot of people are familiar with the World's Fairs in the US, like Chicago or San Francisco, Spain had her own set of expositions and they come with their own list of anomalies. And honestly, they kind of add more weight to the idea that there might be something else going on with these international world fairs. If you're new to this topic, let me briefly break it down. The World's Fairs is a popular subject within alternative history due to the striking amount of inconsistencies in the mainstream narrative. In history, the World's Fairs were these massive international showcases where nations came together to flex their technological and cultural achievements. Huge pavilions, elaborate architecture, entire cities thrown up in shockingly short time periods, as with the Chicago World's Fair being built in less than 2 years. And it sounds impressive until you really start investigating it. The official story is that most of these structures were made from temporary materials like wood and plaster. They were never meant to last. They're just decorations basically. Of course, they decided to demolish the rest of the buildings, and they also used the excuse of a great fire destroying several buildings. At first, that may seem like no big deal, but you see the same story over and over again, and it begins to become suspicious. Not only that, if the Chicago World's Fair was temporary, why is it that the only existing structure from the event is a permanent structure? The Palace of Fine Arts from the Chicago Fair is still there and made from solid stone. Even if we go along with the mainstream story, say sure it was just wood and plaster, it still doesn't add up. These were massive projects. We're talking domes, fountains, statues, manicured gardens, electric lighting, and supposedly it was all built in under 2 years? Using 1800s hand tools, no cranes, no power saws, no trucks, just horse-drawn carts and muscle. Now compare that to what it takes to build something today. Even with modern equipment, bulldozers, concrete mixers, trucks hauling in materials, it still takes years to complete a large-scale project. So how exactly were they pulling this off back then? No electricity, no heavy machinery, no mass-produced materials, just manpower, and somehow entire ornate cities pop up out of nowhere, right on schedule. And where's the actual evidence? Not the finished photos, because we have plenty of those, but where are the construction shots, the workers, piles of raw materials, the blueprints? What we mostly see are a few images of scaffolding on buildings that already look basically done, most likely just being painted on or touched up. And when people try to prove the construction narrative, they usually point to a few close-ups pulled from that old British Pathé documentary. But of course, that's going to follow a scripted version of events. It's meant to sell a story. This isn't just a US issue. When we look at Spain's fairs, Barcelona 1888, Sevilla 1929, and the second one in Barcelona in the same year, we see the same pattern. Grand architecture that seems to come out of nowhere, timelines that make no sense, and just like in the US, a suspicious lack of photographic or documentary evidence showing how it was pulled off. Let's start off with Spain's very first World's Fair, the Universal Exposition of Barcelona, which took place from April 8th to December 9th, 1888, supposedly drawing in over 2 million visitors. According to the official story, Barcelona wanted to impress the world, showcase itself as a modern, sophisticated city, and figured hosting a huge fair was the perfect way to do it. They chose the site of an old military fortress called the Ciutadella, and supposedly transformed it into a massive, ornate public park and fairground, all in less than 2 years. But this is where things start to get strange, because that military fortress wasn't just any ordinary fortress. It was built right on top of an ancient neighborhood known as La Ribera. Now, the mainstream story says this area had been unpopular because the military had controlled and repressed Barcelona's population from here. But there's actually more to it. Back in the 13th to 15th centuries, La Ribera was basically the economic heart of Barcelona. Wealthy merchants lived there and even built these grand palaces, some of which apparently still exist today. One very impressive piece of architecture that's still standing in La Ribera is the famous Basilica of Santa Maria del Mar, which makes you wonder what other significant buildings might have once existed in this neighborhood. And it gets even crazier. The original fortress, the Citadel of Barcelona, wasn't just a random military fort. It was a star fort. So wait, the first World's Fair in Spain took place on the remains of an old star fort? Officially, they demolished it to make way for the new Ciutadella Park, where the fair would take place. But wait, during the siege of Barcelona in 1714, after Catalonia's defeat, a huge portion of this La Ribera neighborhood was completely leveled. Today, archaeological ruins from this demolished neighborhood sit underneath the former market hall known as the Mercat de Born. This raises a pretty obvious question. What exactly was in this area that was so important, and why was it wiped clean multiple times throughout history, only to be rebuilt into something entirely different? So the story goes that the Citadel of Barcelona, a massive star fort, was demolished during the Revolution of 1868, when a civilian uprising overthrew Queen Isabel II and kicked off what's now called the Democratic 6 Years. That whole period is its own rabbit hole, and if you look at the political cartoons and illustrations from that time, there's some pretty blatant Freemasonic symbolism scattered throughout. Wouldn't it be a stretch to think that this might have been another controlled event, just like with the French Revolution? Now officially, the civilians destroyed the military star fort, but for some reason they decided to keep 3 structures, all of which were later used during the 1888 World's Fair. One of them is this military chapel, supposedly built in the 1720s. So a fort needed a church? Interesting. Then there's what's now called the Palace of the Parliament of Catalonia, said to have been constructed sometime between 1716 and 1748. The last building is now the Verdaguer Secondary School, which used to be the governor's palace. The point is, there are at least 3 standing structures from the 18th century that were never demolished. That's over 100 years before the fair even started. Let's pause there for a second, before we even get to the fair itself. Because think about what that implies. We're told the World's Fairs in America were built from scratch, using temporary materials, and designed to be torn down after a few months. But many researchers have pointed out how that narrative doesn't make sense. The scale, the speed, the lack of construction photos, it all raises serious questions. This has led to theories that the fairs weren't built from scratch at all, but were using pre-existing structures from an older civilization that's been scrubbed from our history. Now that might sound far-fetched, until you look at what happened in Spain. Here we have physical proof that the very first World's Fair in Spain reused older architecture and even modified it, right there on the fairgrounds. And not just any buildings. One of them is now literally the seat of the Parliament of Catalonia. So this wasn't just leftover rubble. They built the exposition around structures tied directly to military control and government power. Suddenly the theory doesn't seem so crazy. Maybe the only reason we find it hard to believe in the US is because we've been taught this clean-cut version of history where Columbus discovered an empty land and nothing advanced existed here before that. But what if that story was just a cover? I mean, think about it. The Chicago World's Fair is called the World's Columbian Exposition, celebrating the supposed 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World. So let's begin with the official poster for the Barcelona Universal Exhibition of 1888, which right away features unmistakable Masonic imagery, specifically the 2 pillars. But if you look closer, there's something even more esoteric hidden in plain sight. A Kabbalistic tree of life layout, You can clearly make out the 3 spheres, or Sephiroth, stacked on each pillar, then 3 more in the center, with an angelic figure at the top, likely representing Kether, the crown. Why is this level of occult symbolism associated with a World's Fair? And it's not just abstract either. Each sphere is labeled with one of the supposed virtues or strengths of the Spanish nation. Mining, commerce, architecture, navy, international, industry, and in the very center of the arch is the double-headed eagle. Also, it would seem this lady on the bottom left is Minerva, as there is an owl right there beside her, another common motif used by secret societies. Now, if you thought that was a stretch, let's look at another official poster. This one shows a group of robed figures sitting in front of the exposition's grand entrance, which we'll get to in a moment. Right away, Hermes stands out front and center, and again we see 2 pillars framing the entire scene. That's not an accident. At the bottom, there's a pair of inverted compasses with what looks like a candle or torch motif in the center, another nod to esoteric or Masonic symbolism. But take a look at the architecture in the background. There's a massive obelisk in the background, not sure what that's all about, and notice the electric cables strung across the skyline. This is 1888. Just how advanced was this infrastructure supposed to be? But what really caught my eye though is this woman seated just left of the center. She's sitting on a throne, writing in a large book labeled History. What exactly does that have to do with the World's Fair? Why is history being written in the middle of this symbolic display? It almost feels like we're not looking at a celebration of the present, but a reframing of the past, like they're presenting the fragments of some older advanced civilization and using it to legitimize a new age. Now, I tried looking into this and it's hard to get a clear answer, but when you type in what was the first World's Fair to showcase electric lighting, you get the Columbian Exposition, or the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. However, that doesn't seem to be the case. The Barcelona International Exposition of 1888 had its own display of advanced electric lighting, and that's pretty significant, especially when you consider that the Chicago Fair was famous for being the battleground of the War of Currents. So how is it that Barcelona, 5 years earlier, already had sections of the city like La Rambla and Plaza de San Jaume lit up electrically? And inside the fair itself, they were using electric light for atmospheric displays, like the Magic Fountain, which combined synchronized water movement with bursts of colored electric light. We're talking about 1888 here. Electricity was still considered a cutting-edge luxury. So how did they already have the infrastructure to do all this? The first piece of architecture that really stands out is the Arc de Triomphe, which was supposedly built as just the main access gate to the 1888 Barcelona World's Fair. Now, this isn't just some temporary plaster arch. This is a full-blown red brick monument built in Neo-Mudéjar style. Right off the bat, you have to ask, why go through that much effort and expense just to build an entrance gate? And of all styles, why Mudéjar? A style traditionally associated with the very civilization you're supposedly conquering. The body of the arch is built from gorgeous red brick, but then it's adorned with Portland cement sculptures, including the main friezes and coat of arms. That part feels thrown on, like the base structure may have existed prior and they just dressed it up for the fair. And if you look at the coat of arms, you'll notice 2 prominent pillars flanking the central shield. Sure, that's common in heraldry, but it's also a well-known Freemasonic symbol. And hanging from the chain beneath it is something people wouldn't catch: a golden fleece, the emblem of the Order of the Golden Fleece. A secret chivalric order tied to European royalty, Freemasonry, and the Templars. So again, what does any of this have to do with a supposed cultural exposition? You also have 2 lions supporting the crest. But if you go back to the original poster, it actually looks like the design intention may have been griffins. And then there are these creepy bats. Yes, literal bats that seem to be holding up the arch with the coat of arms for the provinces of Spain. Maybe it's just me, But why would bats be guarding the entrance to a world fair? There's something eerie and symbolic about that choice. Now they have this whole story behind it, but I don't know, I feel like there's something else to it. Supposedly, it was a symbol of James I of Aragon, because a bat landed on his flag and he took it as a sign. Some versions say that the bat alerted the king to a surprise attack from the Moors or Saracens. That feels like a made-up legend, but this kind of thing is common in Spanish heraldry, and there's just something unsettling about it. Interestingly, before the bat, it was actually a dragon. So maybe the symbolism ties into something else entirely. Maybe something a bit too deep for this discussion. The whole structure is massive and expensive looking, far beyond what you'd expect for something meant to be just a decorative entry point. And as we'll see later, budget issues plagued the exposition from start to finish. So where did this money come from? And more importantly, was this really built for the exposition? Or is the exposition a pretext to reintroduce or repurpose something that was already here? Next is the Cascada Monumental, said to have been started in 1875 and then completed just in time for the 1888 Expo. It's a massive fountain and waterfall structure located in Citadel Park, and it's supposedly inspired by the Trevi Fountain in Rome. The whole thing is pretty elaborate: statues, a triumphal arch, ornate stonework. But what's weird is in the oldest photos I could find, there's no water. So was it originally even a working fountain? Also, the first thing that stands out are the sculptures right in the front. Dragons and griffins. If you don't know, those are symbols used on the flags of Tartaria. So it's definitely strange to see them featured here, and we'll notice them popping up in other places too. Another odd detail is that supposedly, there was an aquarium built into the back of the waterfall. But I couldn't find any photos of this aquarium, no images of the tanks, the fish, nothing. And yet above one of the doors you can clearly see the word aquarium. And there was even a brochure promoting it at the time. So what was really going on back here? And why is it that there's so little documentation of something that should have been a major attraction? Next, there's the Columbus Monument. And once again, we see a World's Fair tied directly to the symbol of conquest and discovery. It's a 200-foot tall monument that was supposedly built specifically for the 1888 Expo. They say construction started in 1882 and took 6 years to complete. The funding? Well, according to the official story, it was a mix of private donations and public funds. Sounds convenient. But what's weird is this seems to be the only structure from the fair with any actual construction photos. And even then, there are only two. One shows the base structure before the column was in place, but it's got some strange exposure issues, classic vanilla sky, and the whole thing feels staged. The second is just a close-up of the Columbus statue before it was lifted. But again, where's the actual process? Where's the photo of them placing the pillar? That would have been a pretty huge moment. And it's not that placing a statue is impossible, far from it, but I wouldn't be shocked if this was the only part they actually built, and everything else was already here. Because here's the thing, this monument is loaded with symbolism. It marks the so-called new city of Barcelona. The entire port area was brand new to most residents. It had only been reclaimed from the sea about 20 years earlier. So what do we have? A towering statue of Columbus, the literal icon of the new world, a new age, standing on top of a column where at the base, we see Scythian-looking queens wearing dragon helmets, and just above them, two griffins holding up the pillar. So symbolically, it's saying the old world empire, the dragon bloodlines, the Tartarians, are the foundation that supports the rise of the new world. Okay, but let's move on to this castle they supposedly built for the 1888 World's Fair. And this story is just ridiculous. We're told that this large brick medieval style building called the Castle of the Three Dragons was built in just 1 year, between 1887 and 1888. And get this, it was meant to be a cafe. Really? You're telling me they had the budget, time, and labor to build a permanent neo-Gothic castle out of brick just so people could grab a coffee? They don't even have a clear story on the name. Supposedly it comes from a satirical Catalan play from 1865, but it's never really explained what the connection is. And then after the fair, the place was just abandoned. It wasn't until several years later that it was converted into a museum. But let's just entertain the idea that they did build this castle in 1 year. Right next to it was another major structure, the Palace of Fine Arts. Another massive brick building built for the same expo, and this one's even more mysterious. There's barely any information about when the construction actually began. You'd think that something this important would be well documented. But no. What we do know is that it was eventually bombed in 1938 during the Spanish Civil War, and then demolished in 1942. But again, no construction photos, no timelines, just this vague story that it was built for the fair. So now you've got two large brick buildings, both supposedly constructed in under a year, both right next to each other, both with zero photographic evidence of construction. That's starting to look a little suspicious. And if that wasn't strange enough, just outside the castle, there's a weird fountain called the Fuente de los Niños. This was sculpted by the same artist who worked on the Arc de Triomphe. It's considered one of his masterpieces, but honestly, it's kinda creepy. The kids look terrified as they climb into a large vase. Some of them look like they're drowning, and right on the front of the vase is this demonic face. What is that supposed to symbolize? Who thought this was an appropriate public sculpture? Alright, but I'm just getting started, because this whole story gets crazier. If you thought the other stuff was unbelievable, wait till you hear this. The next thing that we need to talk about is the Hotel International, which was this massive structure supposedly built just for the 1888 Barcelona World's Fair. And they claim that it was built in 53 days. That's right, not months, days. And of course, because that's completely absurd, they tell us it was a temporary structure made from metal and plaster. There it is, the classic excuse. When the timeline makes no sense, just say it was temporary and made from cheap materials. Problem solved, right? But seriously, look at the photos of this thing. Does it look temporary to you? And they try to explain it away by saying that 650 masons and laborers, 100 carpenters, and 40 plasterers worked day and night to pull this off, and even worked through the night under the glow of 18 electric floodlights. Yeah, sure, in 1887. The hotel supposedly had capacity for 2,000 guests, with 600 rooms, and 30 full apartments for families. That's a full-on 5-story hotel covering 5,000 square meters. And the part that really doesn't make sense is they built all of that just to demolish it a few months after the fair. And there were actually lawsuits trying to save it. There was a public pushback to preserve the building, but the courts ordered it torn down in May of 1889. Another mysterious building is this Palace of Justice, because they say it was built from 1887 to 1908. But in the earliest photos from the fair, it's fully finished, and it's another massive building built from stone. This is also another very important building, as it currently houses the High Court of Justice of Catalonia. I couldn't find any construction photos, but I did find some interesting aerials. Another structure built from stone was the Palace of Science, but I could only find one photo of the structure and there's no information on when this was constructed and how long it took. Then we have the Palace of Industry, which is the main hall of the fair. And there are 2 construction photos that I could find. With one on the exterior, where most of it's already built, and then one on the interior. But again, it looks like they're doing renovations and converting a previous structure rather than building from scratch. What I find interesting is there are barely any photos of the actual event with peoples in the halls. There are a few photos of crowds around some type of religious congregation, but for the most part, most of the photos are actually just engravings. And the photos we do have just show the place empty. There are no details on when the construction began, but the entire structure spanned approximately 70,000 square meters and was flanked by 2 towers, each standing 48 meters tall, which housed large electric spotlights. It was demolished in 1930, and the site is now occupied by the Barcelona Zoo. Now before we move on, there's one more thing I wanted to bring up that's kind of weird. Apparently there's this urban legend that the Barcelona City Council was offered the Eiffel Tower before it went to Paris. Supposedly, it was proposed to be built right where the Arc de Triomphe stands today. But the story goes that they rejected it, so it ended up in Paris instead. Now officials today say there's no truth to the story, but let's break it down anyway. The Eiffel Tower was unveiled at the 1889 Paris World Fair, literally 1 year after Barcelona's 1888 fair. And whether or not they actually rejected the tower, we do know that Barcelona was considering 3 different tower proposals, all of which would have rivaled the Eiffel Tower. The first one was called the Lapierre Tower, which was this 200-meter wooden structure proposed by a French group. And they wanted to make this of wood. If you look at the sketches, it actually looks more like a Moorish Mudahar version of the Tower of Babel than anything else. They say this was a serious proposal, and that it was actually approved, but they had to cancel it because it was too expensive. Which is odd because it was supposed to be wood, not even steel or iron. So how expensive could it have really been? Then there's the Condal Tower, a lighthouse-style tower made of iron, stone, and brick. This one was going to be 210 meters tall, and it seems like they were serious about it. It was approved too, but apparently the project never happened because they couldn't decide on a location. Really? You approve a massive tower, and then forget to figure out where you're going to put it? That doesn't really add up. And yet there are brochures and illustrations from the time that show this tower, or something suspiciously similar, being promoted in the background of viaduct and fairground images. So either way they were planning it, or they were covering for something else. Then the most insane of all of them, the Carbonel Tower. This one was supposed to be taller than the Eiffel Tower. They said it would have been 350 meters high, which would have made it the tallest structure in the world at that time. And get this, they claimed it could be built in just 2.5 months. That was published in the Vanguardia on February 27, 1888. But again, we're told it was cancelled due to lack of public funds. So you had all these big dreams, 3 massive towers, some of them supposedly greenlit, and then suddenly you just couldn't afford it? Then why go through the effort of designing, approving, and promoting them? It almost feels like some of these towers might have actually existed, and these proposals were just a convenient way to explain them away. Or maybe they were repurposed or demolished before the public caught on. Either way, there's something off here. Now let's just take a step back for a second and really think about the bigger picture here. We're talking about a city that had just gone through a massive political reset, only 20 years after a literal revolution that dethroned the Queen and flipped the entire government. This was supposed to be a time of instability, bankruptcy, economic struggles, and yet somehow, they're out here throwing one of the most extravagant international expos in Europe? Like, where did the money suddenly come from? Public funding? Okay, sure. They even admit that there were budget issues and last-minute cuts all over the place. But we're supposed to believe that they managed to build permanent castles, palaces, massive fountains, multiple iron towers proposed, a full hotel for 2,000 guests, plus electric lighting, in 1888, and then just casually tore most of it down right after? Why? Why was this so important? Why this push to make Barcelona appear like a futuristic, advanced capital right at this moment in history? It's like someone needed to reset the narrative and fast. Nothing about the timeline adds up, and the deeper you look, the more it starts to feel like this whole thing was more about rewriting the past than celebrating the present. Okay, but Barcelona had another World Fair in 1929. Now before we get to it, I want to be clear. I'm not saying it would have been impossible to build some of these structures at that time. And I'm not even insisting that they had to belong to some lost civilization. But as we go through this, you'll start noticing that something about this story just doesn't add up. Whether these structures were already here or not, it really seems like we're not being told the full truth. I always try to keep an open mind, but I just want to say that up front because for some people, the idea of a cover-up happening as late as 1929 might seem far-fetched. But let me walk you through why I find this incredibly hard to believe. So the weird part is that Spain hosted two World Fairs at the same time in 1929. One in Barcelona and the other in Sevilla. And they both ran from May 1929 to January 1930. Now think about that. If this is supposed to be a big international event, why would you split attention and resources across two cities at once? And this isn't pocket change, we're talking about massive projects being funded right after World War I. Sure, Spain stayed neutral during the war, but it still got hit with inflation. Prices nearly doubled in the post-war years. Yet somehow, they still pushed forward with the exposition. It was originally planned for 1917, but delayed because of the war. Now the first thing I thought was, if these buildings were already here, how could they hide them from the public? Especially in the 1920s, with more photography, more press, more people moving around. Well, a huge piece of the puzzle is how they decided the location for the fair. The exposition was built on Montjuic, which has its own deep and kind of murky history. According to the official story, one of the hardest parts of the whole project was securing the land. The exposition needed at least 110 hectares, but as of 1914, the city of Barcelona only owned 26. So that means the majority of Montjuic wasn't even city property. It was either privately owned, controlled by the military, or belonged to other institutions. That alone is sketchy, and most of this area was already off limits to the public, that it would have been very easy to hide or repurpose existing buildings without anyone noticing. And it gets more bizarre. Montjuic is on a mountain, so we're supposed to believe they constructed all of this on the side of a hill in just a few years? The official construction timeline goes from 1917 to 1923, but World War I didn't end until late 1918. So at best we're talking 3 to 4 years of possible construction. Then for some reason it gets delayed for another 6 years. That doesn't add up either. And just to make things even more interesting, during this whole time, Spain was under a dictatorship. Miguel Primo de Rivera ruled from 1923 to 1930, so this was a military regime. Spain was under authoritarian control, meaning full top-down oversight, no transparency, no public accountability. If anything was covered up, hidden, or rebranded during this period, there is nobody around to stop it or even question it. Interestingly, Montjuic actually means Jewish mountain, and it's considered the birthplace of Barcelona. It's the site of multiple fortifications, including the Montjuic Castle, which dates back to the 17th century. But the history gets pretty dark. This area was synonymous with barbarism and repression, especially during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The castle functioned as a military prison and torture center, and at various points, the cannons of Montjuic were literally used to bombard the city and its own citizens. So just keep that in mind when they say that this was chosen as the perfect spot to celebrate progress. But what's even more interesting is that Montjuic is considered the oldest inhabited area in the city. It was the site of an ancient Iberian settlement called Barceno, which later evolved into the Roman city of Barcino, aka Barcelona. And this Barqueno wasn't just some scattered huts, it was likely a major trading hub, with evidence of coin minting found on the hill. If you've seen Spain Unveiled Part 1, you already know these so-called Iberian tribes might have been way more advanced than we're told. So was the decision to place the World Fair here really just for space? Or was it another case of covering up something much older? So now that we understand Montjuic wasn't just some random empty hill, let's talk about what they claimed happened here in preparation for the 1929 exposition. According to the official story, they transformed this mountain into a massive World Fair site in just a few years, building grand palaces, fountains, pavilions, gardens, and even an entire stadium. And they did all of this while dealing with political instability, dictatorship, inflation, and a limited city budget. The first structure we have to begin with is the National Palace. This was the main site of the 1929 Expo, and it's a massive structure. It was officially constructed between 1926 and 1929, so only 3 years. That means they supposedly decided to build this as an afterthought while the fair was being delayed. Most of the fair was supposedly already finished by 1923. And as they were waiting, they just figured, hey, let's just build the most significant structure of the entire event and make it the centerpiece. That's the story. Again, I'm not saying it's impossible. And yes, there are a few construction photos, but I only could find a couple, and all of them are close-ups. One is the interior under construction, and sure, it looks legit, but it's still just a tight shot. The second is taken from the top of the structure, again another close-up. This is 1920s, we should have hundreds of photos documenting every stage of construction. Photography was widespread by then. Exposure time wasn't an issue. They could have done a full photographic record or even a time-lapse sequence if they wanted to. But instead, we're left with a few vague images and expected to just accept the timeline. And this wasn't made of wood and plaster. It's a massive building made of iron, concrete, and so-called artificial stone. Multiple towers, a dome, detailed ornamentation. Even today, building something like this in under 3 years would be a massive feat. So just take a step back and look at the scale of this fair. You're telling me they built all of this? Even the Plaza de España was a huge undertaking, and we barely get any photos of that either. There's one image from 1926 where it's supposedly half finished. Except wait, if the construction of the palace started in 1926, how is it already halfway done? That's before the Venetian towers were even put up. Then suddenly we get a finished photo with all the scaffolding. And I want to stress again, I'm not saying that it couldn't be done in 1920s, but something about this whole thing is off. Interestingly, there are these 4 pillars, and I find this to be a really strange story. So supposedly, 4 columns were built, and in one of the old photos you can actually see they did paint people in. Why? Who knows? But clearly they were already doing photo manipulation back then. And then for some unexplained reason, they demolished these columns in 1928, right before the fair. The official story says that the dictator Primo de Rivera ordered them to be taken down, but there's no real reason given. Why remove them right before a major international exhibition? And to me, these don't look like newly built columns. In the old photo, they already look ancient. Maybe these were real ancient pillars they didn't want people asking too many questions about. And then on top of everything we've already talked about, they supposedly built several palaces and pavilions for the fair, including the Press Palace, made of brick, the Palace of Agriculture, Palace of Chemistry, Palace of Modern Art, Palace of Textile Art, the Projection Palace, Palace of Decorative and Applied Arts, Palace of Provincial Councils. Are you starting to see where this sounds insane? And that's not even all of them. There are even more pavilions, but one in particular really caught my attention. the so-called Belgian Pavilion. There's barely any information about it, no clear start or end date for construction. In the earliest photos I could find, it already looks incredibly old. It just stands out in a strange way, like it wasn't built for the expo at all. It was already there. And on top of that, apparently they even built an Olympic stadium in a single year. That seems over the top for just a stadium, but apparently they had an infinite budget here, because why not? Now that pretty much wraps up most of the fairgrounds. You had the Magic Fountain again, with the spectacular display of color and water choreography. But one of the most impressive features of this whole World Fair was the electrical lighting. They say it had one of the largest electric lighting systems of the time. Buildings were fully lit inside and out, and behind the National Palace, they installed these massive sky projectors that literally beamed light into the sky. And if you look closely at some of the old photos, a lot of these urns and lamp structures look like they're glowing. They were also showcasing new technologies at this fair, including some of the earliest prototypes for broadcasted television. Now that might sound minor, but you have to remember this is 1929. Most people had never even seen a radio up close, let alone a working TV. It's an understatement to just say that this was a massive project. It's almost unbelievable how much was constructed in such a short time. But that's not all. You also have the Gothic Quarter, which is said to contain the oldest parts of Barcelona, including a Roman wall and medieval landmarks. But it's kind of weird. They say a lot of what we see today was actually reconstructed in the early 1900s for the 1929 World Fair. Supposedly, it was a part of this big restoration effort to make the city look impressive to international visitors and the world's media. One thing that stood out to me was the Barcelona Cathedral. Now this thing is next level, dating back to the 13th century. There's a lot to unpack with it. Interestingly, the choir stalls feature the coat of arms of the Order of the Golden Fleece. Keep that in mind. But what's weird is they say the cathedral was renovated from 1880 to 1920. And supposedly this is what it looked like in 1880, before the neo-Gothic facade was added. But then you see photos from 1900s and it's basically done, with classic vanilla skies. Even stranger, there's an engraving from 1850 that shows the facade already there. So which is it? How did it disappear in 1880 and reappear by 1900? And there's a photo from 1890 where the people honestly look like they were painted in. But we're supposed to believe it went from this to this in less than 10 years? But it already existed in 1850? Timeline doesn't add up. But another interesting thing is that there are multiple griffin motifs throughout the cathedral. One is attacking a lamb, and then the other is in combat with a soldier. Is there symbolism here? Do the griffins represent a specific group? I found a source claiming the griffin represents the Moors, and the lamb symbolizes Christianity. But then you see a soldier, apparently it's a Saracen, also fighting the griffin. So what does the griffin really represent? Maybe it wasn't just Christianity versus Islam. Maybe it's more like the elite versus an older culture. And the lamb might actually symbolize royalty or secret societies, especially with that golden fleece reference. And I'm not trying to get too unhinged here, but I'm sorry, this is literally just a story. But this right here is Wilfred the Hairy, which seems to be a Bigfoot or something. Or at least that's how he's depicted. Kind of like Harry Mary and even the Green Man from English lore. But yeah, they say that the hairy part derives from his return home after his exile's punishment for a vengeance killing. But you can see it on the Gothic detail. He literally has hair all over his body. And if you look, he's actually standing on a dragon. I find the dragon symbolism here interesting because this is another reference to the Dragon Slayer bloodlines. and Wilfrid was said to belong to an elite family of historians. He's also responsible for the construction of this castle of Cordona in the late 9th century. Anyways, I just find it interesting that the griffins represent the Moors. And another supporting element to that is the legend of Esplandian, which is a well-known Spanish novel from the 15th century that discusses a pagan warrior called Queen Calafia, the Queen of California, and her army of griffins. Again, keep in mind that the flag of Tartaria was the griffin. So that's the Barcelona World Fair, and we can come back to Barcelona in another video, but I wanted to move on to the World Fair in Sevilla, which also took place in 1929. I actually got to visit this place and walk around for hours, and it's pretty mind-blowing. It was called the Ibero-American Exposition of 1929, and it was smaller in scale compared to the Barcelona fairs. The official story is that they prepared for this for over 19 years, and that most of the buildings were designed to be permanent structures. The most striking one by far is the Plaza de España, which blends Baroque and Moorish revival styles. Now this is a massive plaza, and it's surprising that they would build something like this just for an expo. Because again, like we said earlier, they had to delay everything due to World War I. Spain was under a military dictatorship until 1930, and they had to take out huge loans just to pull this off. Let's not forget the economic crash of 1929 either. Spain took out 24 million pesetas just for this project, which is equivalent to roughly $400 million today. And on top of that, the fair wasn't even a big success and didn't attract nearly as many visitors as they hoped. Now again, I'm not saying it's an impossible feat. Technically, they say the first stone was laid by King Alfonso XIII in 1914, so that's a little over a decade to build this. But I find the wording around that strange. Primo de Rivera allowed the Spanish king to give the final word and officially open the fair. That's odd. But just look at this place. Do you see anything like this being built today? It's not just about the technical ability. It's the craftsmanship, the budget, the intent. And again, why the Moorish revival style? That's a very convenient explanation if the structure was already here. I don't think it's crazy to consider that maybe this was an extremely well-preserved government building from a previous empire. I mean, this place looks so advanced. They literally used it in the Star Wars movie for an alien planet. And it actually works. And think about it, in the movie it's portrayed as a government royal palace complex, kind of functioning like a terminal for the arrival of starships. Obviously that would completely flip our history upside down, so they need a way to explain it. Hence the World Fair. I'm not saying that's what happened, but I do think it's worth considering. Because where's the actual evidence that they built this? There are a few construction photos, but honestly they aren't very convincing. One is an aerial shot from 1924, where the entire layout is already in place. Another shows the plaza before the towers were supposedly put up from ground level. But again, we have vanilla skies. Then there's this one, supposedly of one of the towers being built, and it's extremely low quality. And that's pretty much it. But for me, a few photos is not enough, as it is important to note how easily photos can be faked. But for a project of this scale, in the 1920s, you'd expect hundreds of detailed construction photos. I don't think that's asking for much. And let's not forget, if this structure was already here and they were trying to sell a different story, faking a few staged images wouldn't be difficult. And as I was looking for old photos, I found this one, also dated to 1924, same year as the aerial. You can clearly see the plaza is done, but the water section isn't there yet. And somehow the tower is already fully finished. Not only that, look closely at the staircase. You see foliage creeping up the column. Vines. Why would that be on a brand new structure? Did they add that intentionally, or was it already there? Because if this was fresh construction, that kind of growth shouldn't exist yet. Why would that be there if this is a brand new structure? Did they add it, or did it grow naturally? So yeah, I don't buy the mainstream story here. It really feels like something's being kept hidden. And it's not just a plaza, there were several permanent pavilions built just for this fair, all just as impressive. Again, you have to look at the entire picture. Spain wasn't just building one World Fair, they were building two at the exact same time, both in cities with deep ancient roots, and both involving massive construction projects that were supposedly completed in record time. These weren't wooden pavilions or plaster facades, these were massive stone palaces, plazas, stadiums, and entire districts, permanent structures. And all this was happening during a time where Spain was under a military dictatorship, meaning there was a tight control over information and media. If there was ever a time to erase or rebrand parts of history without public backlash, this was it. And the bigger question is, why go to such extremes? Why would a country in economic turmoil, recovering from a war-induced inflation crisis under a dictatorship, dump the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars into two back-to-back expos? Who benefits from that? Was it really about tourism and pride? Or was something being hidden in plain sight? These expos feel less like celebrations, and more like theatrical performances, grand showcases meant to reintroduce something old as something brand new. Something definitely feels off, but what do you think? It's clear that this wasn't just a phenomenon in the United States. These world fairs were happening all over, and it starts to make a lot more sense when you realize it was likely the same group behind them, most likely tied to secret orders or elite networks. But let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe these structures are recycled architecture? Let me know if there's another site that we should check out. Share this with someone who's ready to question the narrative. And as always, all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?